After having laid out of college for approximately one semester, after the first year, I didn't have enough money to go on and go to college any longer, so I took the time to get a job and accumulate $500 so that I could re-enter school, and the school I had in mind was Texas A&M. In early January of 1942, another guy from home and I went down to Texas A&M to make sure we had a room reserved for us. I would be there on the day that registration started. By sometime in early January, before the 15th probably, I was registered in A&M in chemical engineering. It was a real experience because the discipline was so tough and you couldn't get away from it because you lived with the officers that you were serving, the student officers. It was all military, and they ran a tight ship, including they looked at our grades at the end of each 6 weeks when the grading came out. It was posted on the board. Our upperclassmen read our results, our scores, and then came around and talked to us about if we had any weak places. The whole field artillery outfit I lived with all lived in 2 floors of a 4-story dorm. The routine was pretty tightly controlled. We had to be studying by about 7:30 every evening in our rooms with the doors open so that they could come down the hall and check on us to see that we're applying ourselves. When 10 o'clock came, you might play your radio real low if you couldn't hear it in the hall, but the lights were out. Mm-hmm. It was time to go to sleep because we were going to get up somewhere around 6:30 in the morning and start all over again. I stayed with it 2 semesters, that spring semester, and then they created a 3-semester year, and I stayed on through the summer semester. By that time, my $500 was used up, but it was used real well. I could stay in that dorm with that artillery outfit, buy books, have enough clothes that I didn't have to worry about going out and getting any before I went back to work. Had meals in the mess hall. We all ate in a common mess hall. So we had board, we had a room, we had our meals, we had our laundry, all paid for with something like, and tuition. It was pretty small, but the whole bill came to about $30 a month. So my $500 went quite a little way, but it did finally run out.
Now, what made you go to A&M? I mean, was this you were planning on going to war? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a place. A&M was a military school, military college, where you could get a commission on graduation, and that's what I had planned. But by the time I had put 2 semesters in, and I had to go back out and recharge my bank account by going to work again. When I'd done that for a while, it was obvious that I was going to get drafted if I didn't volunteer. And I wanted to be in the Air Force. So after coming home in roughly September 1st of 42, I went down to the Army Air Corps recruiting station in downtown Abilene and took my initial test, which was a battery of written problems, questions and answers, to more or less assess whether you were physically and mentally prepared to go and get the training that you needed to become a member of a bomber crew or become a pilot on a fighter plane or whatever in the Army Air Corps. It was to see if you were trainable in the periods of time that they allowed to train for those jobs. And it usually amounted to a basic training program and then an intermediate program, then a final program where you went from one type of airplane to another. At the end of that time, which was usually about 6 to 7 months, you had to be ready to go and be trained in combat planes and get ready to go overseas. So that's what I was in from the time I got out of Texas A&M until that was in, what did we say?
You were at A&M from January to October.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, sometime in October, late October. I signed up for the Air Corps and passed my tests downtown and was accepted and told that I was officially in there, in the Air Corps, but I was on reserve until they had a place for us in one of their training programs. And that took from that October date until sometime in January of 1943.
You were in college before you went to A&M?
Yeah, I was in McMurry College before
Oh, okay.
I went to Texas A&M.
Okay, McMurry. And that's in Abilene?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a liberal arts college.
How did you go there just for a couple semesters?
I got a one-year scholarship from a woman who lived there locally.
Okay.
And sponsored me
Wow.
generously. And I could tell that wasn't the type of college that I wanted to be in. You had to pick some subjects like art and whatever to make up enough. I've forgotten how many semester hours that you took, but it was something like 14 or something like that.
That wasn't for you.
No.
How did this woman come to sponsor you?
She was the grandmother of a friend of mine, a moneyed family in town. My brother and I had this acquaintance of this fella. He liked both of us and found out that I didn't have the money to go to college after high school yet, and got his talked to his grandmother into giving me a scholarship.
Okay. So that was campus in town there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was walking distance from my house. It was probably 6 or 8 blocks.
So you did that for a year before going to A&M?
Yeah, 2 semesters. Fall and spring. Fall of 40 till spring 41.
Okay. During this October to January time frame, they're trying to find a spot for you.
In
A commission spot.
Yeah, a place where I could enter the aviation cadets and get the flying training, which at the end would give me a commission.
Okay. Well, that covers A&M. Then you're back in Abilene for that period of time, and you spend Christmas there. And
yeah, I took a job and drove a grocery delivery truck until the time that they called me up to go to Sheperd Field.
Yeah, that's the next stop here. It shows from January 43 to about roughly 6 weeks.
Yeah.
You're in Wichita Falls at Sheperd Field for basic training.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about that?
Well, it was one of the windiest, dusty places they could have probably put us.
That's pretty much it, huh?
Yeah, pretty much it.
Okay.
We did a lot of marching and breathed a lot of dust and wind, and it was a good place to get out of. They put us on a train to go from Sheperd Field to Texas A&M at College Station, Texas. We arrived at College Station at their little train depot, somewhere around 1 o'clock in the morning. On the south side of the campus, there was a more or less rural residential area. Some of the residents there said, "Oh, we remember when your train came in. We were the first bunch of aviation cadets that came to Texas A&M to get training." Now, they said there were about 1,000 of you, and you were all coughing at one time.
So you took the train to College Station. You said you got there early in the morning. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, early in the morning, say 1 a.m. in middle of February. I think the trip from Wichita Falls took about 12 hours. Most all of us had some college training, but they wanted to make sort of engineer, mathematicians or whatever, so that we'd be ready to absorb the training with airplanes, navigation and flight, and So we took a lot of engineering and math, and until we could prove that we knew enough or were learning enough that they could train us in the skills of flying and directing airplanes.
So this is the 2 months at College Station.
Yeah.
Before you went to Kelley Field.
Yeah, we went to class every day, all day long, and it was one of those kind of classes where the joke was that if you dropped your pencil, you'd miss a semester of school.
Mm-hmm. That takes us from February 43 to April 43.
Yeah. At
College Station, and then you went on from April 43 to June roughly 43 at Kelley Field for processing and decide on your job as pilot, navigator, or bombardier.
Yeah.
This is in San Antonio.
Yeah.
Kelley Field, San Antonio.
There was a lot of physical testing that we had done, mostly testing of the eyes and endurance and that sort of thing. And they had so many people there that it just took a long time to get us all there and get us all tested. I'd been there about, something like 10 days or 2 weeks. We were all living in what they call tar paper shacks. They were one-story barracks type buildings that were not painted or anything. They just had tar paper tacked to the outside to keep the wind out. Anyway, I would guess there were 20 of us living in each one of those. Most of the time we were lying around the barracks waiting to be called to be tested or something, or marched or whatever they wanted to do with us. And one morning I was in the barracks with the rest of the guys, and we were all laying around talking, killing time. And all of a sudden one of the guys from my barracks came running into the shack where we were, and he said, I believe your brother must be here. I said, what makes you think that? And he said, we saw you marching down the street with this new bunch of civvies coming in civilian clothes, and one of them has got to be your brother. I went out right quick and found out. I missed his going by the barracks, but I found out where they went to and went down and found him in his tar paper shack.
So I didn't realize Earl was there at the same time you were.
Yeah. I think he applied to be tested for aviation cadets. And then his number came up in the draft before he could get trained, and they made some kind of a negotiation that he could come in as being drafted and satisfy the draft board and then be given to the Air Force for training. He wound up in pilot training. His eyes were better than mine. I wound up as a navigator trainee because my eyes weren't quite up to pilot classification.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the first round of physical testing excluded me from the program. I was classified ground duty only because of my eyes. So I stayed around the barracks a day or two and talked with the rest of the people who were there, talked with them about their experiences, whether they'd passed, talked to them about the things that I had not made a good score on. And they briefed me up on how to beat the test. The way that you got reconsidered was to go before a board of doctors that were Army people, had been enlisted. Let them ask you batteries of questions about your health and what you did, what you came from, what you'd been doing before. And well, anyway, they said, well, it's pretty obvious that you shouldn't be a pilot, but have you considered being a navigator? I said, yeah, I know about it. They said, well, you've had 2 years of college. One of them has been getting into engineering, and you did well. Why don't we retest you and see if you'd qualify to be a navigator? So that's what happened, and I did pass, and I used all the tricks that the guys had taught me about where you're supposed to see the red light appear and where it disappears.
Mm-hmm.
The test for depth perception was a track that's about as long as from here to the wall, just a wooden board track.
For those of us in radio land, that's about 20 feet.
About 20 feet. They had these pegs that would travel in a slot, and each one had its own string. The string was a loop, so that you could push it down as far as you wanted to, pull it back as much as you wanted to. The name of the game was to get them side by side.
Mm-hmm.
The guys told me, well, what you do, so they always bring them up there side by side, and you take hold of the strings then while they tell you the rest of the process. Mm-hmm. And when you're ready to do your testing, you just slide those things like that, and all of a sudden, man, you just stop there right side by side. Your fingers still have the same place on the strings.
Oh, you never moved your fingers?
Never moved my fingers.
All right, so this is Kelley Field, and it turns out that Uncle Booger's there with you.
Yeah, he was training for pilot. Doing pretty good till he flew under a cable in a canyon and got caught. So they just took him out of the program. And that meant that his option then was he could go to gunnery school, but he couldn't be a pilot.
So they hit a cable or something, that grounded him.
Yeah, he didn't hit one, but he flew under one, which was in a canyon. It wasn't like that we're up on level ground. That would have been bad enough, but doing it through a canyon, it did something too dangerous.
Well, I have a question. You mentioned he flew like under a cable. Was that, were they training like to make sure that they could fly accurately?
No,
is that what
it
they
had
to
nothing
do
to.
with?
They weren't even supposed to come near that cable. They were supposed to avoid it.
Oh, okay.
He just decided to be a little daredevil, and I guess that he wasn't the only one who'd done it, but he's the only one who got caught.
Mm.
Oh, so it was
Sounds
just
like a Lawless.
some guidelines.
Yeah.
That they were like boundaries or something that they were supposed to stay away from.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, they weren't supposed to fly under bridges or cables or anything like that. He trained for gunnery down on the border at Harlingen, I believe. Was good at gunnery, and so they just moved him on to more gunnery school up in the west, like Denver or someplace. Yeah, Lowry Field. After they decided that he was one of their better gunners, they sent him to armament school, which is the study of guns, cannons, and stuff for aircraft. And he finally became an armament trainer at Lowry Field. He had just left there and been moved down to El Paso, and I can't remember the name of the field there now. But he was still doing gunnery training at this field at El Paso. And they were flying B-29s, which was a super fortress. It was bigger than a B-17, and long range was used in the Pacific. He was training gunners for B-29s. One afternoon they were up on a training flight, and all the crew. And
this is out of El Paso?
Out of El Paso.
Okay.
And they were flying west of there in some other mountains. I don't remember the name of them, but they're pretty impressive. They had finished their gunnery training for the day, where they were shooting at a target that was towed by an airplane.
Mm.
So they stowed their guns and got ready to circle and go back to El Paso at night. And lo and behold, one of the guns, when it was stowed, it had a round in the chamber, and the gun was hot as fire, and the round cooked off and shot through an engine in the plane.
Mm.
And the pilots couldn't recover, so they started getting everybody bailed out. They landed in these mountains, some pretty austere mountains. It was windy day, and just about everybody in the plane had something broken by the time that they got them out of there. My brother messed up one knee. Somebody broke a back. Somebody broke arms or wrists or what have you. It was a bad day.
They'd all parachuted out.
They all parachuted out, yeah. When they talked...
And it wasn't uncommon to cook off a random chamber, as I understand it.
It wasn't, but the thing that was uncommon about it was that in that high-class technical type of airplane, you weren't supposed to be able to stow a gun pointed at an engine or any part of the aircraft. But somewhere or another, it didn't work out that way.
And he wound up recovering in Tucson, right?
Yeah, he
I remember traveling there. And
I think he had surgery at a couple of places, maybe at El Paso first, and then when that one didn't do the job on his knee, they sent him to Tucson to another hospital. And they never really cleared it up good. He always had a little trouble with his knee, but not enough to limp. When he got out, he got a discharge with a service-related disability.
At Kelley Field, you were there for, was it 30 days or a month and a half?
Closer to 6 weeks, I guess. Somewhere like that, yeah.
So anyway, that's where you trained to be a navigator.
Yeah.
Or decided to be a navigator.
Yeah, started to be a navigator. Less than 2 days after I was tested at Kelley Field for physical ability to be a member of a flight crew, an officer anyway, I was assigned to ground duty only. That would have cut off all hope of ever being assigned to a military aircraft. So anyway, I went back to the barracks after I found out that I had not passed the test and I had been declared for ground duty only, and took myself a nice long nap, and then I began to talk with some of the other people who had taken the test and successfully, and they told me what I should do to go back and ask for a rerun. So anyway, I did, but in the meantime, I didn't get to take the test right away. a week or two went by, and they went ahead and assigned me to a barracks where all of the other people who were there at the time that did not pass the test and were declared ground duty only. I was the only one who was a aviation student. I was transferred to another barracks, a two-story barracks, where other Air Force people who'd been tested for flight capability, physically tested for flight capability, and I was the only one there who had come the route of aviation student and had not had other training yet. But in that barracks there were about 20 or 30 guys who had failed the test after having glider school shut down on them. They were supposed to be glider pilots. That's what they'd been training for.
And why they failed the test?
They had failed the test for some of the same reasons that I failed the test. Mine was eyesight. Okay. Some of theirs was other things. But anyway, they were all physical tests. Mm-hmm. And these guys had all come out of the glider pilot program that they had closed down. They had enough glider pilots to carry out the invasion of Europe. So they stopped training any new ones. All these guys were given the opportunity, if they wanted to go test for aviation cadets. Anyway, these 20 or 30 older guys had failed the test. They were in this barracks that I was assigned to because that was the ground duty only barracks at that particular moment at Kelley Field. Anyway, for some reason or other, the powers that be decided that somebody had to be what they call the CQ, which is a chairman of the quarters. I got the assignment of being the one responsible for all these guys that I'd gone into the barracks with. I don't know why they assigned me, but they did. So I was responsible for getting everybody out in the morning for roll call, getting everybody out to go to lunch. Lunch was easy, but getting people out for roll call with these guys who were already very disgruntled because their program had been shut down with the glider pilot training. And here now they had failed the aviation cadet test, so they were going to go back and do something that was not what they joined the service to do. So they had their backs up. They were kind of rebellious.
So this is where you learned to be a drill sergeant.
This is where I learned to be a drill sergeant. So anyway, it was my job to get them out. It was real tough the first couple of days, and they gave me a lot of back talk, which I knew they knew they could get away with. But after a while, they realized, well, this was just something that had happened to me. I didn't ask for the job. I'd been assigned to it, and found out that I was a pretty amenable guy, that I wasn't trying to give them a hard time. I was just trying to do my job. Then the next thing I found out was that I was the person that they had assigned to do the job of listening to see about dissension and report it to the powers that be. That it was kind of like trying to find out who was a loyal citizen and who wasn't. And that, of course, I could never tell anybody that. If they'd known that, they'd have rebelled all over again. But it was a funny little experience that went along with a bunch of disgruntled guys who'd flunked out, and in the meantime, I got my opportunity to go back and do a test again, and got out of that barracks. By the time everybody was shipped out to go to pre-flight training, like we went to Houston, by the time that everybody was shipped out, well, I got blended back in with the bunch that was going to aviation cadet training.
How long did this whole thing last?
About 30 days.
30 days. Well, that takes us to about June of 43, and then from June until September, roughly, you were at Ellington Field for ground training for navigators.
Yeah.
And that's in Houston.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we had classes every day. We marched in formation from class to class. We had calisthenics for a period every day. They had us pretty well regimented. Our days were full. But it was a lot of fun. They let us out to go to Houston or Galveston, whatever we wanted to do on the weekends, from Saturday noon until Sunday afternoon, I guess around 5 o'clock. So we always went someplace. Had a good time.
Then on to Hondo Army Base in Hondo, Texas, which is west?
40 miles west of San Antonio, yeah.
You got in your 100 flight hours, final stages of training, dead reckoning, celestial navigation, And that went on till Christmas time.
Well, there was also meteorology involved.
Okay.
That's where I excelled. I didn't excel in navigation, but I did in meteorology.
I do remember watching a lot of the weather growing up. I think you're mainly concerned about your garden.
Yeah.
That was 13 weeks it shows here.
Yep.
From September to just the day before Christmas you headed back home to Abilene. Any special thoughts out of Hondo?
One thing that I can remember about Hondo was that it was rather austere, rather hard living compared to where we lived in Houston. In Houston, we lived in Ellington Field. Mm-hmm. We lived pretty close to the mess hall for our side of the plant. It was a combination, airplane pilots and navigation all at one place. But anyway, we had a mess hall with a mess sergeant in it who was a chef. Every meal we had was just great, including breakfast.
Now you're back to Ellington Field.
Yeah, back to Ellington Field. When we got to, I'm making a comparison here, when we got out to Hondo, we got a rude awakening with the first morning we were there with cold bacon, cold eggs, and warm coffee. And it was that way for the 13 weeks that we were there. Mm-hmm. It never improved. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I wanted to tell you about Hondo was that we were trained by officers. They were pretty sharp at navigation. We were broken up into classes, about 50 guys in a class. We had 3 real good guys. One of them was from Chicago and said things like, well, this is the day that we're going to get our haircuts.
Or what?
Haircuts. They're called haircuts. And then he talked about on days we were going to fly, it was into the blue tomorrow. Anyway, there was one guy there they were all different. All 3 of them were quite different from one another, but one of them was a world traveler. He had been raised in Paris by an American mother, and so he knew the world pretty well. Somewhere or another, he decided that I was working at it hard. It was at the limit of my abilities, but I was serious about my work. So I made just borderline grades, but, sometimes like in meteorology, I might make an A. And altogether, I was okay, but marginal. When it came time for the final exam, I had to have a grade of 86 on the test to be able to graduate from the navigation school. So we took the test one morning, and it was tough. About 10 minutes till noon, those instructors went around grabbing our papers, long enough, time's up. And before lunch, we got graded, and mine came back with an 86. Mm-hmm. And I'd made a little bit lower grade than that, but he put a big check mark across this where you couldn't tell what the grade was.
He was a trainer? Is that
he was a
term for this guy?
First or second lieutenant.
Okay.
Navigator, trainer. The way they staffed those training jobs, trainer jobs, was that they would keep somebody behind. If they had somebody who was pretty sharp and handled people well, they'd say, well, you're not going overseas, you're going to stay here with us.
Oh, okay.
And their wives loved it. They were pretty unhappy about it, but their wives loved it.
Oh, they wanted to go navigate.
Yeah.
Go fly or whatever.
Yeah, the spirit was high. Everybody who was in the Air Force that I knew was chomping at the bit to get overseas.
Well, talk about the general mood. I mean, a lot of people today don't know. It's 2005. We've been through Iraq twice. We're still in Iraq right now. We've had Vietnam, which was just about a disaster, and the press did everything they could to, I won't go on politically, but not my tape here, but we've been through a lot of wars, Korea and all that, and so the mood about wars definitely doesn't seem to be the same from reading the history books as it was back then. If you could talk about the general mood of the country back then.
The general mood of the country was that everybody wanted to get back at the Japanese about Pearl Harbor. Everybody wanted to stop Hitler and free Europe, and everybody was willing to do their part. If it meant going to work in a factory and learning how to do a job that they'd never thought about doing, or do things like collect scrap metal and whatever to be recycled into war effort, buy war bonds, whatever anybody, what, honey?
Remember the Victory Garden?
Oh yeah, and Victory Gardens. Yeah, we in the English had Victory Gardens. We'd cut down on the amount of food that had to be bought and traded through the grocery stores if everybody had a garden. Anybody who had any feel at all for gardening would went to work and try to raise their own food.
So the food could go, the mass-produced food could go overseas,
yeah,
if that's what you want to call it.
And then they had all the stamps. You had to have
oh
stamps
yeah, there was rationing.
sugar.
Rationing for a lot of things. It started out with gasoline, and then it was sugar and tires.
So you had to have stamps to
you
get
had to have stamps.
these things.
You could only get so many in a 6-month period or whatever.
Okay.
There weren't any automobiles being made at all. Any automobile that was there at the end of the war had been made before the war.
Mm. I remember in grandmother's, mom's memoirs, that she said that she had been in Florida, the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor. I think they were there for Aunt Helen's birthday, which was Pearl Harbor Day. Before the trip, they had a bum tire in Fort Worth. They went to Florida for their trip, for their little vacation, and came back, and they couldn't get tires.
Mm-hmm.
The war started. Tires were not to be bought.
Well, they could be bought, but you had to. You were rationed on how many tires you could have in a 6 months or whatever.
Okay.
They were called ration books. If I remember. They had ration books, but you could buy so much meat and.
Yeah, meat was rationed. Butter. Sugar.
That's when they began to develop oleo.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't get real butter.
And there was a certain amount of hoarding. One story I heard was some guy that I was acquainted with had gone through Fredericksburg on the way back from San Antonio.
Mm-hmm.
And he had stopped in for a cup of coffee in a German restaurant. All these Germans were talking about their farms and ranches and whatever. And by the way, often ranchers and farmers, or factory workers were exempt from military training if they held a strategic job. But anyway, these people around Fredericksburg and on farms and all could get gasoline for their tractors. And they could get sugar for canning foods and that sort of thing. The delivery man for gasoline ran into the restaurant and said, Heine, I've been out to your barn and I put the gasoline into the barrel that you told me to, the red one. He said, the red one? He said, yeah, you wanted me to put gasoline into the red one, didn't you? He said, that's got sugar in it.
Heine?
Heine, yeah.
With an N.
Yeah. That's a German nickname.
Oh, okay. Because I've heard of Heine, but not Heine.
Yeah, Heine. But yeah, rationing and the scrap metal drives and aluminum drives of all kinds they even saved it. At that time, instead of using aluminum foil, they used tin foil on things like wrapping cigarettes in a package or whatever. People saved the tin foil and made balls of it and put it in the scrap drive. All kinds of stuff.
But the general mood was against Hitler. It was, of course, against the Japanese for hitting us when we weren't looking.
The war effort was very popular.
It sounds like the country was itching to get into, to go defeat Hitler, who was taking over Europe.
Yeah.
And really battling the Brits at that point in time.
Yeah. Yeah, we were getting newsreel coverage of the Battle of Britain. Everybody thought we ought to go over and help. I say everybody. Many people thought that. Pearl Harbor turned that attitude into real flames. It went good. People were rushing down to the enlistment stations in the cities and signing up, the young men. Before the war started, there was a draft. They were building an army even before the war started. The Americans were building an army, and they were doing it by drafting people. But they drafted you for 1 year. And at the end of that year, they promised that they would turn you loose to go back to civilian life. Well, a lot of the guys were just near the end of their 1 year of draft when it came time, when the war hit. Their discharges were canceled. But I knew one guy in particular had been in a unit out at the local army base, and he had gotten his year in and gone back home. He comes rushing in one day. I worked in the PX out there for a while, and he came in, and he was re-enlisting. He didn't have to be called. He was ready to go, and that was kind of a general attitude among the young people. Now the mothers hated it, of course, but at the same time they were proud when their young men were going overseas and being trained for the war.
It probably wasn't back then. I mean, Vietnam seemed to turn a lot of things around as far as our coverage of the war. But do you remember any press coverage that was negative to the war, negative about us getting involved?
None. No.
At any time during the war?
There was one period. The only negative thing that I remember had to do with the Battle of the Philippines. We had a pretty sizable army presence on the Philippines, and right after Pearl Harbor, the Japs came in and bombed and landed and took the place over. And our soldiers there fought. Maybe you've heard the stories. They fought out on a little peninsula at the south end of whatever the big island is, Luzon, whatever it is. Anyway, they got run into this little peninsula where there was no place to go, and then the Japs came in were killing them off in there, and they got in boats and escaped to a place called Bataan Peninsula, and
Is that where
Corregidor was the island, yeah. So they went from the peninsula in small boats out to the island. They didn't get them all off, and the Japs started marching a bunch of them in death marches back north. And the ones then many of them were caught and taken to Japan and killed and tortured, and it was a mess. Anyway, the negative talk was, why did we let those people why didn't we go in and free those people who were trapped on Corregidor? Truth was, we just didn't have the battleships to go in and do it with. But not everybody quite understood that.
That wasn't one of the only places where we lost a lot of soldiers.
No.
We lost a lot in D-Day and all that.
Yeah.
Figured it was part of the inevitability.
Yeah. It was pretty hard for people to understand how we could let those people get caught by the enemy, because there was time enough to go get them, but they didn't go in there to get them. But the truth of the matter was, there wasn't any way they could have gotten them off the island. They didn't have the battleships or fleet or airplanes or anything else enough to go get them. We were in much worse shape than Roosevelt ever let anybody believe at the beginning of World War II. We practically didn't have a Navy at all. Not too many people. They had a lot of foot soldiers trained, and quite a number of airmen, but we weren't quite prepared yet.
Well, last we talked, you were at Hondo and spending your 13 weeks there, and then you went back home Christmas Eve 1943.
Got a 10-day en route leave. They sent me to Dalhart, and Abilene was on the way.
Okay. Well, you were on your way to Dalhart when you stopped off in Abilene.
Yeah.
Okay. Short period of time, probably fairly uneventful.
Yeah.
It's part of our chronology here. And at Dalhart, from January 44 to about mid-February 44, you were in phase training for B-17.
Yeah. Everybody else that was in a crew for a B-17 crew up there was already there and had had some training, and the navigators were the last ones to come in. And we had 6 weeks of training with them, and gunnery and flying daylight flights at altitude. It was miserable because all we had to protect us from sub-zero weather up in the atmosphere up there was fur-lined jackets and boots. We'd go out and spend maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours shooting at targets pulled by aircraft. And it got very, very cold up there.
Now, how high and how cold?
Oh, about 20,000 feet, and it would be well below zero.
In non-pressurized cabins?
Non-pressurized cabins, yeah. We were on oxygen bottles.
Well, how did that affect your ears and sinuses and all that?
Well, it was kind of tough on sinuses for me, but at that time you could buy a little inhaler tube of Benzedrine, and you could sniff that stuff when you were about to start back down in altitude, get your sinuses and everything cleared up. It wouldn't give you much trouble.
That's a upper of some kind, isn't it? Did it wire you a little bit? Or?
Yeah, it wires you a little bit. It's
not too bad.
Not too bad.
Okay. Anything else about Dalhart?
Well, it was far enough to the northwest that we got some really bad winter weather up there. But we had one blizzard while I was there where we were supposed to be going to classes every day or flying every day, whichever the schedule called for. And I remember this morning we got up in the blizzard and we were going to class, and it was very important that we got there on time. And 2 of us left my barracks with all the clothes, as much clothes as we could find that we owned, helmets and goggles and everything else. And the wind was blowing so hard that we got about a half a block and just had to give up. It was snowing hard, blowing hard, and we found out later that everybody else had had the same thing happen. They just didn't get there, and they didn't have the class. But you know, it was like a block away. It wasn't a great distance. But other than that, it was fairly pleasant. The crew I was with was captained by a West Point pilot. What they had decided was that these West Point pilots were more technically trained than the pilots that were coming out of the Air Corps enlistment training program. So they were going to get the B-29s after they learned to fly the B-17s and had a crew trained. Then they were going to move to someplace in New Mexico. And I was kind of elated about that. I was on a West Point pilot's crew. And I thought that'd be great fun. I'd like to fly in a B-29. And so it went right on up to, we were going to move out on the 15th of February. Went right on up to the very last week of February. There were quite a number of people who got mumps right at that time, or they get some other kind of a childhood disease. So anyway, it turned out that one of the officers, the West Point pilot, one of our crewmen got mumps, had to go to the hospital. Well, it's kind of like chickens are when there's some chickens got a bloody spot on him. All the other chickens go pecking on him. Well, that's what happened with, if a crew would lose one person, they weren't going to be able to go to Europe or any place until the crew was refilled again. The powers that be began to pull my group apart, and I wound up still going to stay on B-17s and go to Europe. For some reason or other, I didn't want to go to England. I don't know what it was. I wanted to go stupid like. I wanted to go to the Pacific, because that's where all the action had been for us up to that time. But anyway, against my will and everything else, I was put into another crew that I'd never met before, and we all got on a train in Dalhart, went up to Kearney, Nebraska to pick up our B-17 that we'd fly overseas. So that was the end of the stay at Dalhart.
Where in Nebraska?
Kearney.
You went to Kearney, Nebraska to fly overseas?
Yeah, my memory is a little fuzzy on that. There's a place up there called Grand Isle also, and I think they were close together. And I can't remember whether we went to Kearney or Grand Isle, but we only stayed about 2 or 3 days. Okay. Got our plane.
And that takes you on your way to Labrador, on your way to England?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.